Whenever I talk to other TouchDesigner users, I'm reminded of how much variety there is in terms of how people approach it and what they're doing with it. I've noticed that most of us tend to fall into a sort of spectrum, though, like most times that the word spectrum is applied to people, things are more complicated than just, a single scale from A to B, but I still find it to be a useful way to think about things. On the one end is what I call the artist. And then on the other end is the developer. This often correlates to one's background and experience before approaching TouchDesigner, although there are some exceptions to that. People with a software development or engineering background often tend to fall into the developer category. And most other people, particularly those with an arts background, tend to fall into the artist category. Personally, I tend to fall into the developer category mostly, although I've been trying to kind of grow beyond the limits of that. And we're going to talk about how that works a little bit later. I want to make it clear that this is not about me saying one of these approaches is inherently better or worse than the other. Really, I think the best approach is to combine elements of both, but it takes effort to get to that point. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each end of that spectrum, as well as some advice for each, and then how you can kind of fuse the two. It's also worth noting that this is just my own opinion based off of my experience and what I've observed from others in the community. You may have had completely different experiences. If so, I'm very interested to hear about that. We'll start with the artist end of the spectrum. As an artist, your goal is typically to produce some kind of output, right? Or trying to make a piece of art, whether that's something that goes on a projector or LEDs or lasers or robot arms or whatever. Or the goal might be to use a particular technique and just see where that takes you. The vast majority of tutorials out there are aimed at artists. So they'll teach you how to make audio reactive visuals or use hand tracking on a camera to control DMX lights or something like that. You watch these tutorials and you learn by building things. Most people, including myself, started this way, even if I came from a software development background, just because this is what the educational content is, this is how I initially approached TouchDesigner. The artist's true power is in exploration and experimentation. You try new things, or you might try variations of the same thing, or you have a specific aesthetic that you're trying to produce and you use a variety of techniques to get there. It's hard to overstate the value of this. This is where art comes from. Artists are often less concerned about how things are built and more about what they do. Your goal is to make an art, not, build a marvel of engineering and precision. As an artist, your projects are often going to be pretty flat. So you'll have a whole lot of stuff just directly inside the Project One comp. You're less likely to kind of structure everything into nested trees of subcomponents. You'll also often copy and paste things and then go in and modify them a little bit. You may not care particularly much about, naming things. So you'll typically have lots of things like, Math 6 or Switch 14, and you may not even bother to use nulls that much. Instead, we'll typically just take a channel from an operator that has it, like, Math 6, and drag it over to a parameter with an export or a reference or something. Looking at another artist project network is kind of hit or miss. If things are simple enough that you can kind of just infer from context what things are, it may be pretty straightforward. Like if Switch 14 is choosing between several different images going into a thing that's the background, then it's probably switching different backgrounds or something, and you don't necessarily need to have like a specific name on it that says background switcher. But if the project is more complex, it can be really hard for anyone else to understand what's going on in there, or potentially even for you to understand what's going on in there, a few weeks later. Projects like this often don't handle changes well. Let's say you're creating a scene and you position a cube over here, and then you want to have a sphere that sits on top of it. You'll put the cube there, and then you'll put the sphere there, and you're done, right? And let's say there were also, a bunch of other shapes on top of the sphere. So you just place them all out there and you're set to go. Then later, if you decide that you want to move that entire thing somewhere else, you have to go in and individually move each piece over rather than having some sort of central setting that all of them are based on. And while that does cause some problems in some situations, there is actually kind of an advantage to doing this. It takes time to set up settings like that. And if you're in, a creative flow state and you're just placing things out and creating a scene, sometimes it is a lot faster to just put the things where you want them to go. Artists often work well with other artists. You can take parts of other people's projects and, plunk them into your own and combine them in different ways and, get some interesting results out of that. You may have difficulty, though, modifying stuff that you're using from other people. So, for example, if you start with a project that uses media pipe hand tracking and you want to change it to work with a Connect, you may have difficulty doing that. You'll often benefit from using components created by developers without really paying much attention to how they work inside. And RayTK is a good example of that. It's specifically designed so that you don't have to go inside it and pay attention to how all the wiring inside works. The downside of that is that if those components don't do exactly what you want, you might not be able to change them. This isn't a skill issue, or at least it's not only a skill issue. It's a difference in approach. Adaptable, reusable components may do things in very specific ways that might be unintuitive if you don't have an engineering background. Or they may have been designed in a particular way for a specific use in, another project with different requirements. So knowing why everything is the way that it is might not be clear to you, and you may not even have all the information needed to be able to understand it. Now let's talk about developers. As a developer, your goal is often to make a system that is capable of doing the thing, not just do the thing. Developers will typically name things and often have pretty intense opinions about how to do that. You tend to think in terms of components, and you lay out your projects in nested trees of those. Though there are some notable exceptions of people that like to work in very flat networks for specific reasons, but that's a little bit less common amongst developers. You'll typically use nulls, except in specific circumstances based on rules about which you are, again, highly opinionated. When you're making a scene with a box with some shapes on top of it, you'll define a box position, and then all the shapes will be relative to that location. This means that you're able to handle changes to those things a lot more easily. So if a creative director tells you to rearrange all the boxes, you can just do that because you change that one setting and all the other stuff is based off of it. But building out that capability is slower than just putting the things in the places that you want them to go initially. In general, building intentionally engineered systems takes longer than just slapping things together. There are tools that help with this. Function store tools, which I highly recommend, is a great shortcut for a lot of the kind of good practices that developers tend to follow. You may also not like being rushed in development. I discovered this about myself in the 2020 and 2021 Interactive Immersives Challenge, which involved live streaming, building stuff in real time, and turns out I don't work well in that context where there's like a fixed time limit because I like to do things in very specific ways that are not the fastest. And if you watch the competition, you may have noticed that it wasn't some of my best work. It was still a good learning experience, though. I'm glad I did it. Developers love structure. Things are the way they are for specific reasons. This makes it easier for other developers to understand your work. You can rely on the fact that, param filter 3 is filtering parameters, and it is the third of a collection of those things. This, of course, is kind of an ideal that you aim for, which inevitably comes into conflict with practical reality. But you're still kind of aiming for that. The downside of that is that many of those practices, and I wasn't really fully aware of this for a long time, but those practices can often make it harder for artists to understand your work. Structure typically means components within components within components and so on. As a developer, you've probably been specifically trained to do this. I mean, the whole concept of design patterns and facades and interfaces and adapters and all that, it's all about structure and, nesting things and avoiding duplicate stuff and all that. But that is not intuitive to a lot of people. Generally, in projects made by developers, it's pretty rare to be able to see, the majority of like what is going on in a project by looking at a single network. As I mentioned earlier, developers are often opinionated about which things are good and which things are utterly unacceptable. It's hard to describe if you haven't experienced it personally, but there's a very specific sense of this thing is built wrong and should be changed. If you're working with a project from someone else, you might even insist on rebuilding parts of it that, work, but like aren't doing it the way that you would have preferred. We'll often describe this as cleaning things up or refactoring, but those kind of behaviors are really not conducive to teamwork. Developers work well with other developers if they agree, or if they have their own separate areas, which they will guard against intrusion with all the force that they can. But if there are agreed upon standards about how things should be done throughout the project, working with a team of developers can be efficient and amazing, and you can build some really large stuff. As a developer, you may have difficulty working with artists. While the artist is less concerned about how things are done, that's going to be pretty important to you. And you may find yourself saying things like, why would anyone do that? Or there's redundant stuff and blocks of things that are pasted and they're just, I have said these things many times. The solution that I found for that is to give artists, a defined space in the project where they can create the way that they want to create. I may cover that in a separate video. One of the biggest downsides for developers, or at least for me, is that rather than just, making some shapes in a project with some audio reactivity added to it, we'll spend time trying to figure out how we want to build the best audio reactivity system with all the possible options that we might need in the future. Or you might go through components from the community and figure out which one of them is most suited. And maybe you get that this is not how I would do it feeling and end up rebuilding them. Meanwhile, you've failed to make audio reactive shapes. This has happened to me so many times. Or maybe that's just ADHD. Regardless, doing things correctly is slow, and slow is not always conducive to creativity, at least for me. The conclusion that I've come to is that there's a place for both, and we're all better off if we combine the two approaches. Okay, no. So let's talk about some advice for developers. The most important thing is that exploration and experimentation are critical to creating art, but we need to accept that there's going to be some kind of boring work needed to take those experiments and clean them up to an extent that we can actually use them in the real world. See my previous video for details about that concept. That exploration is important for both your own work as well as when you are working with artists. It's also important to be tolerant of other styles and practices. Personally, I dislike, naming prefixes like base_thing, but it is not worth it a lot of the time to argue about those things. And now some advice for artists. First of all, keep exploring, keep making stuff. Even if developers do things differently, remember that your goal is to make art. That is really the most important thing most of the time. But do put intentional names at least on the important stuff. Trust me, it will save you time later. And use nulls. Next thing is that if you're working on a team project with a developer and the developer insists on changing some of your work and their explanation is something beyond just, I don't like how you do things, they may have some good reasons for doing that. This isn't about them being better or more skilled than you. It's just a different approach that is needed in certain situations. This whole artist and developer concept is key to approaching TouchDesigner. You probably find yourself fitting into one end of that spectrum, but it's important to remember to be flexible and treat each other with respect, because not doing that makes things worse for everyone. Hopefully you found this useful. Leave a comment and let me know where you see yourself on that spectrum and what's worked well for you or what kind of things you've had challenges with. You may also want to subscribe to my Patreon. It's a good place to hear about new tutorials that are coming out, get early access to stuff, get Discord community and project downloads and other stuff like that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification setting.